Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. This is going to be a little bit of what we call it winging it. Okay, we had scheduled an interview or conversation with a scholar named Andrew Futter at the University of Leicester in England, and I think there's some sort of little mix-up. I think he thinks it's an hour later than it really is, and I have to be gone an hour from now. So I want to fill the time as we're waiting for him, and he may show up, he may not, but at any rate, I'll entertain you with wonderful news about all the things that we've been doing lately. In the meantime, while we're waiting and seeing if he comes. So now here's the story. I am sort of, let's say I don't know what to call myself, the editor, let's say, of Project Save the World, which is a project of Peace Magazine, which I've been running for many, many years now. And we have these talk shows every day, every weekday, although I think I'm getting to the point where I really need to cut back a little bit so I can do other work instead. So I may start within a few weeks, a couple of weeks, I may start reducing the number of shows that I do. Normally, I've been doing it every weekday, but I think I'll cut back to about 2 per week, and once in a while, I'll do an extra one. So you can be warned that if you are just eager to watch these every day, you better prepare yourself for this blight of terrible, lack of shows. And so I'll keep you warned about when that's going to happen. In the meantime, why don't I tell you what we've been doing? Those of you who haven't been watching us, you need to know a few things. Partly, I've been wanting the talk shows to bring people to our website, because the website is a very important place, or it should become a very useful facility, a resource for all kinds of activists working in the world together. In fact, we don't work together, we work separately. And I think we need to recognize that some of the most serious threats to humankind are potential disasters that could, kill 1 billion people in short order, and that are causally interdependent to some extent. And so we need to be more aware that people working in one of these areas should sort of be recognize that you're on the same team as the people working in the other areas. And these 6 global threats that we see as most having the greatest potential risk to humankind are war and weapons, of course, especially nuclear, global warming, famine, pandemics, radioactive contamination, and cyber risks. And then we have to look at some of the general, let's call them policy sectors of society, where decisions are made that are more general. That would be governance, problems of governance, problems of economics, and problems of civil society. Hello. Yeah. All right. Good. Thank you. Bye. Okay. Thank you. Bye. Good. Okay. So here I'm going to continue, but Professor Futter has just sent me word that he will be joining us in about 10 minutes. So I can go on and on about what we've been doing. But at any rate, I want everybody to know that what I have put the most of my attention into for the last 3 years or 3.5 has been the development of a website to savetheworld.ca. And that if you go there, it's now a much more functional website. I think you'll find your way around, because we've just put in some instructions on how to navigate. And websites are not necessarily easy to find your way through. but the instructions should make it much easier for everybody. So go there, and I want you to enter comments about what you're doing to share with other people. Both if you're working on one of the threats, these 6 global threats, then go to that threat, whatever it is. It might be famine or hunger, and enter and look for a comment column, and then you can post whatever you want there. If you want to tell us what you're doing or what your organization believes in or is trying to do, it'd be wonderful. And if you come across an article, you can post it there. And so I want you to feel that this is a meeting place where you can share ideas with people working on your similar issue, your threat, or with people working on other threats that are interdependent. For example, if I just picked the word famine. Well, famine, we don't have too many famines nowadays, and the ones that exist are part of warfare. They're not caused by actual climate for the most part yet. Well, any of them really so far in the last many, many years, they've all been caused by one warring population or group trying to coerce another one or defeat another one by starving them into submission. So they're all related to war. But, it's also going to be within 5-10 years, we're going to have food shortages of a major scale caused by global warming, most likely. And so all of these things, you can see the linkage among these issues. You couldn't solve famine without addressing problems of governance or of warfare or of climate change, or also of disease, because pandemics, when a pandemic occurs, now that's not true of COVID, but on the whole, when a pandemic occurs, when there's a famine, people don't actually die of starvation for the most part. They die of disease. They get so weakened by their hunger and so on that they catch something awful and die of whatever that disease is. So you can't address famine independently. You actually need to think about it as part of an infectious disease process. So you see, all these things are so connected that we need to have a bigger view about it. So please start using tosavetheworld.ca as a place to share your concerns and your information, because now, in addition, of course, we produce these talk shows, which are every day about some aspect of a global threat. And sometimes it's about hunger or something. Today, it's going to be about nuclear weapons, which is my longest standing personal investment in saving the world, because for the last 40 years or so, I have been engaged as a peace activist in trying to abolish nuclear weapons, and it hasn't worked yet. We've off and on made some progress in terms of reducing them, but then they bounce back and become even more of a threat. And right now we're in a period when most of the nuclear owning states are keen to expand and modernize their nuclear arsenals. So it's a bad time from the standpoint of nuclear weapons. It's becoming more dangerous, not easier. And therefore, we want to, we get distracted, because we have so many other problems. And we're certainly right now mostly concerned about COVID, but the minute we get that handled, we'll have to go back to focusing primarily on global warming. And this summer, or later in November, I think, the meeting of COP in Glasgow is going to refocus some of our attention, thank goodness, on global warming as an issue, climate change. because we're going to have the meeting of the states there where they decide again what they're going to do, and in the next phase of trying to reduce the threat of global warming, which is very ominous, I'm sorry to say. So, then you think you get that handled, and sequentially, the thing you do next for sure would be nuclear weapons. We'd certainly go back to doing that. No, probably not, because we're going to be worried about something else. We have to worry about things like radioactive contamination, the nuclear power, for example, what we're going to do about whether we're going to have power plants, nuclear power plants, or we're going to strictly abolish or limit those and turn to sustainable sources of energy, mostly, of course, solar and wind power. So all of these things, we can't just do them one after another. We have to be able to multitask and think about all of these issues pretty much at the same time. So nobody can do everything. It's too big a juggling act. So we have to listen now and then to what the other folks are doing who are specializing in one or another of these various risks. And of course, nuclear weapons is, to my mind, something that is so important, because we could lose the whole human population under the worst scenarios. We still have many thousands of those things active and ready to go, and open to mistake. You could accidentally think that somebody's sending a nuke your way, and you got to reply immediately, or else you're going to lose it. You lose your chance because they'll wipe you out. So before they even land, you have to launch a retaliatory strike. And suppose the thing is a false alarm. Well, it could happen. It has happened. It does. False alarms happen all the time. Here comes Andrew Futter. Okay, we're just in time to get down to working on nuclear weapons. Hello, Andrew.
Hi there. Sorry about all the messing around. I apologize for that.
I'm just glad to see you. It's very good to see you. You are, I believe.
How are you?
I'm doing great. And are you in Leicester, England now?
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Sunny Leicester.
I don't know where Leicester is. What part of England is that?
So it's pretty much right in the middle. So it's 100 miles north of London, pretty much dead center of England.
Well, I've been to Oxford, but that's as far north as I've been. How far are you from Oxford?
50 miles. It's not far.
Okay. How about Cambridge? Where's Cambridge in relation?
Yeah, about 60 miles. So if you go sort of like that from both, we're in the middle there. So we're just literally, if you put a pin right in the middle of England, that's roughly where we are.
Okay, good. Well, I'm glad you're here because I've already started talking about nuclear weapons. It's a topic I tend to gravitate toward, and I'm sure it is for you too. Now, we had a conversation a couple of years ago, maybe, I've forgotten exactly when, I believe about a book that you had written at that point. And it was largely about the question of one of the things that should haunt everybody is, would it be possible? Is there any conceivable risk that somebody could get hold of some electronic and internet kind of linkage and launch a nuclear war? Either by accident or in that case, it wouldn't be accidental. Somebody would be trying it. And so we had a conversation about that. And it was unsettling because I think the answer wasn't very definitive. But we could recapitulate a little of that and then go on to talking about other research that you have done since then. Because I believe you have published another book in the interval, right? And which I haven't read, I'm sorry. But please, can you kind of give us a recap of your conclusions about the risk of potentially starting a nuclear war by having somebody grab control of the electronic system and launch something, and then we'll go on.
Absolutely happy to. And just horrible self-promotion, but this is behind me. So this was the book that that was published back in 2018, and the title's "Hacking the Bomb." And that book was really trying to explore the relationship between what we've termed as cyber threats and nuclear weapons and nuclear order. So to try and make some sense of what was possible, what should we worry about, what's the future agenda look like for scholars and policymakers alike. And one of the things the book tried to do was not hype things too much. So the sort of the classic thing of the war game, the 1983 film War Games, the scenario of a teenager in their bedroom causing a nuclear launch. Well, that is one, albeit very, very minute possibility, but actually the threat was much more nuanced and much broader and more complex than that. So one of the arguments that I wanted to make was to say, look, it's not just about these unique or specific, very narrow threats, but actually a whole range of things, right? That includes espionage, indirect attacks, all the way through to directly attacking nuclear systems, as Stuxnet had showed. But to get across the point that we shouldn't be too confident. It may be pretty unlikely that someone can hack into, US, UK, or others' nuclear systems or the control systems on which they rely, but it's not impossible. We shouldn't be overconfident about this. That there have been examples in the past, that some of which have involved computer systems, where we've been lucky that it hasn't caused or led to escalation or use, and that this is probably going to become more acute and more worrying as we go forward. So as I say, the main aim of the book was to sort of set this out and say there's a lot to this. There are many different threats that we need to be aware of and think about how we go forward.
Well, when you say this is going to be more of a threat as we go forward, I don't want to hear about that, but yes, I'm afraid we ought to hear about that. In what way? I mean, I'm aware that there are many new angles to the nuclear potential, largely, I think, through this modernization program that almost all the nuclear states are looking to improve their arsenals, make them, and lots of them, I think, have to do with making smaller, not bigger, but smaller battlefield type nuclear weapons and so on. But if you see some new potential threats, where would those new threats come from?
So I think it's a mixture of things. I think you're absolutely right to point to modernization as being a main driver of this. So a number of years ago, there was the fact that the US Air Force was replacing the old floppy disks and the big sort of cabinet-sized computer machines that it used in various aspects of nuclear command and control were being replaced by modern digitized things, much smaller, much more capable. And it was sort of derided, like, well, how could you rely on a floppy disk to do these things? And of course, it wasn't perfect, but it was a lot more secure from the types of threats we look at today. So
no kidding. So digitizing it makes it more accessible for somebody to break in. Is that the idea?
Well, it would make it easier for. I mean, there are risks and vulnerabilities associated with having older systems as well. That they might go wrong, whatever else, but they tended to go wrong in ways that people could understand and see. In a kind of an analog way where something just literally might be broken and you could see it. Whereas I think the risk today is that things may go wrong or intruders may enter systems and you wouldn't know, or you wouldn't necessarily know what they'd done, what they were doing. And indeed, they wouldn't necessarily know where they were messing around. And so I'm not saying that this would be easy to do. I'm not saying that there are lots of people wanting to do it, but it is an aspect of nuclear modernization, of our current nuclear world, of keeping nuclear weapons ready to be used quickly, that we have to be aware of and have to be trying to build in, or the thinking needs to be built into how we build systems, if indeed we want to build systems in the future, to ensure that they are as cyber safe as possible.
Mm-hmm. Last week, I interviewed Gary Seymour, who was Obama's, I think they called him the WMD czar, the man in charge of weapons of mass destruction in Obama's administration. And he was, I guess, very instrumental in producing a meeting that was directed toward just trying to improve the safety of nuclear materials altogether, mainly, I guess, or exclusively. I don't know whether it was just about nuclear weapons or whether it was also about nuclear power, but at any rate, they had some big meeting. And I guess the main purpose was not to disarm, but to try to look at all of the hazards that were being created. Do you know about what went on in that meeting and what they attended to? And are you confident that they were properly mindful of the new risks that you see as emerging?
So I'm not aware of that, of which specific meeting that was, but I know that during the Obama era there was a real focus on the broader aspect of nuclear security and the security summits. I think there's 4 that were hosted to bring together expertise to try and raise standards about how we protect all sorts of nuclear material anywhere, a sort of a follow-on to the non-Lugar threat reduction stuff in the 1990s to really drill down and make sure that no nuclear material or know-how was available to terrorists or for other proliferation concerns. I don't know that cyber aspects were a specific part of that, but I suspect it was part of discussions, and I know of various initiatives or various people that have led projects, both within and outside of government, to consider the cybersecurity aspects of nuclear facilities, but also nuclear weapons as well, trying to build some sort of understanding, maybe some level of trust, but sharing best practice between different states as well. Now, it's difficult in this realm because a lot of these states don't really trust each other, and a lot of them are concerned about what the other may well be doing, and because of the much more intangible nature of some of these threats. But I don't know what was discussed in the specific meeting or meetings that you mentioned, but I do know that there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes, mostly track 2, track 1.5, and in some cases I think track 1 to really bolster the security that underpins all types of nuclear material.
When you say track 1.5, you're going to have to explain.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm using it correctly, but track 2 is in people like me, academics and people sort of on the outside. Track 1.5, where you have a mixture, maybe with some government and policy officials, although maybe they won't be as active within that. They may just listen. And then track 1, which is literally your principal government people, policymakers speaking to each other.
Well, okay. So how much, I would say, how much, I would ask, how much access is there to the decisions being made in all 3 of these tracks? Do track 2 people have access to track 1 decisions, find out what's really going on? Or to what extent are you guessing or snooping? How do you get your information? And how much do you trust your own sources?
Yeah, it's a difficult topic to work on. It's often the case with being an academic. The most exciting and interesting things are also the ones that no one will actually tell you about. So yeah, it's difficult. So some of it is speaking to people directly involved, and they can help guide you. They won't necessarily, of course, they won't give you any secrets necessarily, but they may guide you to say, here's something that's of interest, or you should look into X, Y, and Z. Quite a lot of stuff around this is actually open, is published. So cyber strategies are pretty open and pretty, they're out there. Some of the discussions that are had around this at track 1 level are, of course, secret, that as makes sense. But there's quite a big discussion around the NGO, think tank, academic world, and people that have been inside and outside of government or international institutions to try and raise awareness and try and raise understanding and cooperation around these issues as well. So yes, you can't necessarily get out all the information you'd really want, but there is enough of a climate of people wanting to learn about this and do well and find, if not solutions, then way to mediate some of the risks that you can operate within the space.
How much difference is there from one country to another? Are some countries more transparent than others?
Yeah, no? I mean, just as you'll know, some countries' systems just are more transparent than others in general, no matter what issue you're looking at. It is much easier to research these types of things in the US or the UK, not least because of language as well. Do tend to be a lot more open. People, a lot more things are on the record. A lot more people will, a lot of more officials will speak openly about it. It's more difficult in other parts of the world. It's more guesswork in some other parts of the world. And it's why often one of the difficulties with the broader subject of nuclear politics, if you like, is we focus it so much on Western examples, which is problematic, but is often the result of what people can get hold of. Now, that is different if you have language skills. I think you can probably gain better access into certain countries, and if you are I don't know, well respected within that country, if you're well networked, I think that helps. But it remains, particularly on a topic like this, something that is far easier to glean information in the Western world, or certainly the sort of US, UK, North Atlantic world, than it is in some of the other nuclear armed states.
Well, what about how smart or really well knowledgeable, let's say, well informed the leaders are, the people who making the decisions in various countries? Can we have any confidence that the prime minister of X, Y, or Z has a full appreciation of the risks and all the potential problems that he is sitting on? That if he makes a mistake, he can cause catastrophe. I did, for example, an interview with Pervez Hoodboy in Pakistan, and I got the impression that from him, I think he really means to convey the impression that the people making decisions in Pakistan are pretty clueless about what might go wrong and how risky the situation is. Is that do you have any insight into the how clued in various political leaders are, or even military leaders are, about the risks involved?
I think it's probably not necessarily the straightforward answer, but the reality is it really does depend on who it is in which countries are. I think there's always the possibility to try and understand and learn more about issues such as this, given their magnitude and importance. But if you're a leader or senior person within one of these countries, you've probably got a lot of things you have to be aware of. I would be concerned, yes, the number of people in policymaking positions maybe don't spend as much time on these types of issues, on nuclear risks, or whether it's disruptive technologies and everything else. And that's because some of it's quite complicated, right? It takes, I assume a lot of people are surrounded by other people that do know about this stuff, but education is an absolutely fundamental part of all of this. That's what underpinned the cyber book. It's what underpinned the more recent textbook, is trying to give people the tools to make decisions, to understand that nuclear dangers didn't disappear in 1991. They are here. They may be different in some ways, but we need to understand it. And the fact that in the kind of nuclear ecosystem that exists today, actions taken through social media in other ways can have pretty significant effects. So it's understanding systems, it's understanding threats, but it's understanding sometimes how this different context can be interpreted by other actors. And social media is a good example of this, but there are a number of other ones as well. So it is incumbent upon us as scholars or NGOs or activists to try and ensure that policymakers have the best knowledge and understanding of these issues they can. Whether they make the decisions we want, it is not really up to us, but to make sure that they have the correct information, understanding of what a particular threat might look like, what in the cyber realm, well, what does it actually mean? What are the types of vulnerabilities we're talking about, and a whole host of things as well. It's not easy, it's not straightforward, but I think that's our job as as academics and scholars, practitioners, etc.
And of course, not just the leaders, but also the general public. And I think that's where maybe we're behind the curve. I was teaching at the University of Toronto. Well, I've been retired for 20 years, but I kept on teaching a free course. And the one I taught for about 5 years after retirement was called Public Health in a Nuclear Age, where more than half of it was about nuclear weapons, the other about nuclear power issues and, radioactive contamination and so on. But they told me I couldn't do it anymore because they don't want people teaching for free anymore, because I think graduate students thought that it was maybe taking a job away from them, as if there were any graduate students who could possibly teach such a course. There was none. And so I'm not able to teach it anymore. But I wanted to teach it because, not that I'm anywhere near the kind of expert on nuclear weapons that you are, but I know a couple of things, that are worth knowing. And the problem was there wasn't a single course on nuclear weapons at the entire University of Toronto. To my knowledge, there still isn't. And so I really want to congratulate you for having a course on nuclear weapons at the University of Leicester, right? How did you do it? Did you propose the course, or did they hunt for you because you know a thing or two about nuclear weapons and want to offer such a course? Tell me, because I don't know how many other universities offer these things. I'm a sort of a grassrootsy kind of person. I'm out there trying to inform the public about a number of different global issues. Certainly, not, for the longest time about nuclear weapons, but so I went around giving talks, in general to the public and churches and things. And but as a university course, there's just a glorious indifference to the topic. How widespread is that indifference in UK? And how did you manage to teach this program that you have?
Yeah, I think it's really important. So I think the first thing to say is that what I've tried to do is built on some brilliant foundations, to the best of my knowledge, in the US and in the UK. So Bill Potter and the team over in Monterey at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies have been teaching this stuff for decades. King's College London in the UK have had a real interest and an expertise in this, and the Centre for Science and Security Studies there for a couple of decades. So I guess what I tried to do a little bit with this course was just build on some of the excellent work they've already done, and sort of affiliated with both of those places, and by no means the only ones. I think a lot of the leading US universities now will have nuclear or strategic or non-proliferation type courses. So I think there was a real renaissance maybe 15 years ago, 10 years ago. It all kind of seemed to go away during the 1990s, which I guess is when you were doing a lot of your work, and a lot of the interest in it with the end of the Cold War perhaps fell away, but it returned, I think. So there's a real
no, some of it was later. I think in the early, I can't remember when I stopped, but it would have been about 5 or 6 years ago that they told me I had to stop. But I'd been teaching the course for 5 years. So you see, it was after 2000. I'm sure that I was teaching that, and the reason was, as far as I could tell, there was no entire course. Now, I believe that in the political science department, there may have been some courses that had one lecture or something like that, but that's totally inadequate.
Agreed. And I guess one of the things that when I got to Leicester that I was very lucky with is one of the things they do is encourage members of staff to teach on specialist subjects. So there are some parts of the curriculum that are established, and of course all undergraduates have to take. But in the third year of undergraduate study, you take very specialized modules. So as an academic, you're encouraged to create your own module. And given what I just said about some of the influences of others that are doing brilliant work in this field, I wanted to try and make my own version of that. And it struck me the generation of students coming through, so this was about a decade ago, just didn't really know anything about this at all, and stemmed from a few talks that I would give and ask students, or even parents that had come to open days, what do you know about nuclear weapons? And it'd be very, very little. And it struck me that here's a really, really important gap for us that we need to fill. So there's the driving force behind wanting to do the course, and also the driving force between some of the public engagement that I do as well, and that others do, and of course of writing this second edition of my textbook as well, to try and get some basic ideas and understandings out there to people, because I think, as you said a while back, it's absolutely fundamental that people at the top understand what's going on. But equally, our society and our understanding and ability to mitigate nuclear risks is at its strongest when everybody has an interest or an idea of what's going on as well. So yes, it's about the classroom. Yes, it's about trying to give next generation of leaders and students an understanding and appreciation of what I think is something that's fundamentally important, but also to reach a bit more broadly as well, to try and recapture interest amongst society in these issues, which perhaps fell away at the end of the 1980s.
Yeah, people were so sure that we'd ended the Cold War and that handled everything. Yeah, it's a pity. Now you're saying that you think there has been some revival of interest academically. So I'm behind the times that way. You think that there are maybe, maybe I haven't looked at the calendar at U of T. Maybe there are some courses now. I don't know. But in general, of course, these things are often taught in special, disciplines or almost separate disciplines, strategic studies. And I think, okay, tell me how you would characterize the ideological perspective or the assumptions that tend to be shared among people working in such a department or interdepartmental program as compared to people, say, teaching peace studies and conflict resolution and that kind of thing. Would I have what may be an unfair, I don't know, I may be wrong in my prejudice, that my impression is that a lot of strategic studies departments are really training grounds for people wanting to climb the ladder in becoming nuclear warriors. Tell me, please reassure me that I'm wrong.
Well, I think, again, it's not a one size fits all answer to that. There are probably some places where there is more of a kind of traditional realist national security focus, and maybe some places are de facto training grounds for people that sort of go into government jobs. Perhaps I don't see that as being the story across the field, and I don't really see that as being the story in the UK. I think strategic studies more broadly is kind of dissipated as well. We don't really have centres or departments of strategic studies anymore in the UK. It's just something that's gone. But what you do have now, and I think what's coming through, is nuclear issues, proliferation, disarmament, nuclear security is becoming increasingly part of this broader spectrum of threats that we look at. So as you say, post-conflict resolution, humanitarian security, critical feminist approaches to security, and nuclear issues are just kind of a wider part of that. And I think what you have now is a much more, well, it's hard to compare, but what we have today is quite a varied debate, where if you go to a nuclear weapons, politics of nuclear weapons conference in the UK, you will have some really quite different views on things. By no means homogenous, and by no means would the strongest views be, the characterization you made, the sort of the war fighters, the people that want to go and do this stuff. There's probably especially in Europe as well, a much more critical focus to this, trying to understand nuclear issues, trying to think about how the sort of hegemony of ideas about deterrence can be challenged, and all sorts of things around that. So I think it changes. I think it's different. I think it's probably quite far removed from the departments of strategic studies from the 60s and 70s and whatever else. I think it's quite different now. I mean, the one thing that I would just add, linking to your previous questions, what we're seeing now in the UK especially is a number of people completing PhDs, so doctoral work on nuclear issues more broadly. A considerable proportion of those people, or a considerable move towards gender balance in terms of the types of people that are pursuing those PhDs, and indeed careers in this subject as well. So what I think you're having at the same time is a more diverse type of debate around nuclear issues, away from the old style strategic studies, deterrence, fight wars, hegemony, is also a change in the nature of the faces and people that are involved as well. I can speak, let's say, for this definitely in Europe, but I think it's also happening in other parts of the world as well. So all of this, I think, means for a slightly different way of approaching the subject, and maybe different answers or different research questions going forward too.
Okay, I will take heart from that. I seize on every little crumb of basis for optimism, but I still have questions about whether that's true worldwide in all of the nuclear states. A couple or 3 years ago, I was trying to contact experts on nuclear weapons in Russia, and I phoned a bunch of people and asked, sort of sniffing around, trying to find out what their attitude was. And I honestly came out with a less optimistic point of view, in that I concluded then that these experts at various institutes would not be able to take a critical position about, say, Russia's nuclear weapons, that the most they could say, and I could name, if I were being rude, some of the leading figures in Russia, very, very famous people, and the most critical perspective that they would enunciate would be to say, well, we need to reanimate arms control talks. That we haven't been doing enough arms control. But in terms of talking about actual disarmament, I almost had the feeling it was taboo. That if they had believed that we really need to get rid of nuclear weapons, they would not be free to say so, or if they did, they would lose their jobs. Am I making this up, or is that your sense too?
I think that's certainly true for some people in some countries, in some situations. I think that's almost certainly true, that it's a taboo subject and you have to toe the line. I do think, from my experience of interacting with not so much policymakers, but certainly NGO, think tank type people, professionals surrounding in some of the countries that you mentioned, there is more of an appetite to engage in debate. If not necessarily, be completely bowled over and accept sort of these broader ideas of disarmament or whatever else. But I think there is maybe it's a younger generation, a generation that didn't grow up or didn't hone their thinking during the Cold War, that are coming through now. Again, a more diverse generation, a more diverse group of scholars in many of these different countries that maybe are a bit more open to this. But I think you're right, and I think you're absolutely right that there are some countries and some people that probably do find it very hard to speak out in certain ways. But that's not enormously different for if it was in the US or UK, where you would still have to toe to some extent whatever the government line was on something if you were in a certain role. So I do think the real area for progress is around the establishment of professional NGO think tank communities in some of these countries, where accessing policymakers in the policy space is more difficult. It's creating that climate of ideas that maybe policymakers will listen to, or informally or whatever else. That may be the real area to try and engage in debate, and to try and, if not change minds, then at least inform or get ideas into the areas that we feel they need to be.
Do you have any contact yourself with scholars in, say, Russia, or at least, even China, or some of the other nuclear states, who are working on these things? Do you have meetings? Do you share papers? How much cross-fertilization is there?
So there's a fair amount. So one a great initiative that I was involved in was called was a thing called the Euro-Atlantic Young Generation Leaders Network, and this was established by the European Leaders Network in London to bring together young. I think I just about still qualify as young. I think under 40 was the idea, from across the Euro-Atlantic space, who were had worked in policy, academia, whatever else, to have regular meetings. And we, before COVID, would have regular, maybe once or twice a year, in-person meetings, and we would discuss difficult topics, Ukraine, arms control, Iran deal, energy security, whatever else it was that would affect all of us in different ways. And the idea was not necessarily that I would be convinced by a Russian friend's view on this or by whatever else, but that we would have an open discussion in a forum that you were able to air these opinions. So that's just one example of where it's happening. But there are a number of other initiatives like this, and there's been a real push, I think, from particularly recently retired policy people to encourage a new generation or younger people with new ideas into this space.
Recently retired, or people like William Perry? What kind of people are you talking about?
Well, he would be a good example. But a lot of the people I've engaged with are sort of recently retired from the policy world, have seen maybe where change needs to happen, or seen the importance of engaging new voices. And have pushed a lot of these things in different ways, and that's from a number of different countries across the world, as far as I can see. But so there are things happening, and it's obviously made easier by various social media platforms, and not least Zoom and Teams and other things as well. But there are so I would say I've got a network of colleagues and friends in most of the countries that you would talk about, and you can share ideas, you can send things, you may not always agree with what they say, but I think it's creating that climate where you can disagree. but just to try and understand.
Okay, what about the difference between official and unofficial communication? Back in the Cold War days, back in the 80s, I was often in Russia on, very impressive groups of people would invite me. I don't know why, but they did. And they would say things that were official. And I knew that they were reading from a script practically. But then in private, if 3 minutes later, they would say something very, very different. Now, do you find that ever happening yourself, that the people who are being recorded take one point of view that they don't necessarily privately hold?
Again, it's difficult because it would be different for different people in different circumstances. I've certainly had conversations with people off the record that maybe say something slightly different to what they may have said otherwise, but that's done under strict confidence and whatever else. And it's not something I could ever use in my research. Probably a better example is having discussions with people, with policymakers or recently sort of people that have recently left office. That's less about telling you what they think and telling you secrets or anything like that, but more about saying, here are issues that we are interested in. So it's about having a bit of a steer sometimes, probably in a slightly different way from your interactions, but I guess at my lower level, it's about, here are things that are of interest to the UK government at the moment, or the MOD is really worried about this. Have you thought about doing something along these lines? And that's quite useful for an academic to be able to think, well, what is important, what's useful, how can my research, which of course has to be open and not sensitive, be useful to policymakers as well. But I think the original, so to answer your original question, I think those discussions by people who are very well trusted, who are very well connected, are absolutely essential, and are probably how diplomacy has gone on for ages and will continue to happen in that way as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now thank you for this backstage look at the kinds of interactions that go on that wouldn't be necessarily reflected in what you write. Now let's turn to your more recent book and your more recent research. What have you been up to since you did this Hacking the Bomb book?
So quite a lot of different things. So I suppose the first thing to talk about, and I've got it in front here, was I did the second edition of the textbook, which I mentioned earlier. So it's called The Politics of Nuclear Weapons. And the idea of that book, as I said, was to try and map out a sort of 101 guide to what are nuclear weapons, who's got them, what do they mean, how do we understand the politics, all of this sort of thing. So almost this, if somebody doesn't know anything about them, they could pick up this book and then hopefully have an idea by the end. So presuppose no prior knowledge or anything else. And so I've used that with my students here. I know other colleagues have used it elsewhere, but it is also meant as something that anybody can read that is interested in this topic, that wants to get a 101. So that's something that I've been doing, again, as part of this broader engagement, public outreach and education aspect to my job and to my career. The second component has been a broader project investigating what we're terming as a move into a third nuclear age. So there's an idea, an imperfect idea, that nuclear history can be divided into the Cold War, which is the first nuclear age where we're worried about the US and Russia and massive nuclear war, and we had MAD, whatever. There's a second nuclear age where our attention turned to different types of threats, the regions, rogue actors, and away from the US and Russia. And the argument that I'm trying to make with this project, or what we're investigating in this project, is, are we now on the cusp of a new nuclear age where it's where a mixture of geopolitics and disruptive technologies are changing the rules of the game again? So we need to focus on different things than we have been for the last 30 years and possibly for the last 70 years too. Cyber, as I mentioned earlier, or computer network operations are part of that, but it's also a whole host of other things as well. It's about precision technologies. It's about advances in sensors underwater, above ground, in space that can track nuclear systems. It's about information warfare. It's about increasingly capable missile defenses, both right and left of launch. It's about a whole range of different technologies that are happening at the same time, and a return to geopolitical rivalry that may be transforming the types of risks and where we need to focus our attention in the current nuclear world. So it's a bit of a shift from the textbook, but it's a project that I'm lucky enough to have funded by the European Commission, European Research Council, and build a team here at Leicester to look into it. So we're roughly at the start of that, but it's trying to build up a picture of, if we are we moving into a new era in our nuclear story because of these dynamics? If so, what does it mean? And third, what can we do to keep us safe going forward?
Mhm. Does this have any connection with the development of AI?
Yeah. So depending on how you look at it, because some people would argue that types of artificial intelligence have been used in various parts of the nuclear enterprise for quite some time. But yeah, it's part of this broader, again, digitization, transformation in the way that states operate, the way we live our everyday lives, which increasingly then impacts, I think, the way we do nuclear weapons, or the way we think about nuclear weapons. So it could be anything from the use of AI to facilitate first strikes, possibly by the ability to manage much considerably larger amounts of data quickly. It could be using types of AI to facilitate autonomous weapons, possibly autonomous systems or autonomous weapons, possibly even autonomous nuclear weapons. It could be a whole host of different applications. So I would definitely say that AI, autonomy, and the kind of a move possibly, or the possibility of shifting control from humans to machines is definitely a part of this transition, or possible transition too.
Well, what I was wondering is whether anybody has gone so far as to talk about autonomous weapons that are nuclear. I mean, I would hope not. It's scandalous enough that there's any talk of any autonomous autonomous weapons. Killer robots, I think, should be banned before you even give a name. But the idea that there might be, I don't even want to think about it. The idea that you might have a machine deciding when to start a nuclear war. Now, I have a friend who's a high-level person in the AI movement. He's one of the founders of a particular approach that's now basic to the new AI. And he, I would say that his view is that we have 6 global threats that we think of as being real serious threats of human extinction, things that would kill 1 billion people, or maybe all of us. And he, I don't know whether he would add it as a separate one, but among either that or as a component of cyber risks in general, he would say that AI is in itself the most dangerous thing coming up, which is not everybody would necessarily think so, but he thinks that we're with the things like the Internet of Things, the automation of all these different subcomputer systems in our lives, that we're going to be for sure vulnerable. So naturally, my mind wandered when you were talking about new technologies that pose new risks. I was just wondering to what extent AI is part of that.
So I think that's absolutely right. The thing that I always come back to with this project and with specific technologies, and I think also with AI and autonomous systems, these are political decisions to build them, to field them, to decide what role they might play. So sometimes in these discussions, we can get into a world where we think the technology is kind of almost making its own decisions. And of course, that's the Terminator sort of idea that you alluded to in there. But for the moment, this is still driven by policy decisions. Humans are making decisions about what these AI can do. Now, is it possible to do some of the things you said, to have a fully autonomous nuclear delivery system or response system? Probably, or will be in the future. Do we want to build that? Well, we kind of hope not. And I think part of this is part of the problem around the sort of AI and nuclear risks literature is a conflation of all the things that come under AI. I mean, AI varies from quite discrete, specific software that, if A happens, then B happens, up to things that you talk about, sort of machine learning, very, very sophisticated, very clever, more, very autonomous types of system. Now, it kind of depends what you want to deploy, where the human stands, or where the human is in relation to that technology, the control they have. So it's different. my fear, as is yours, I think, is I do not want to see fully autonomous systems that can fire nuclear weapons. That strikes me as being a terrible idea for everybody, actually. I can't really understand why a state would think that would be a particularly wonderful idea. But it is important to have the discussions around this to stop that happening, because notwithstanding what I said about these being policy decisions and are hopefully being done for a particular purpose, the types of technologies we're talking about today do have that there is an ability for it just to sort of, I don't know, carry out of control, to spiral out of control, to be technologies looking for missions, and you end up in a position where you don't necessarily want to be. So I think the discussion around this is really important. I think AI is absolutely fundamental, although it means so many different things. Rather than talking about AI, it's probably better off thinking about applications of AI, especially in this realm. But yeah, I think it's an absolutely fundamental part of this, and interlinks with all the other technologies that I'm interested in: cyber, precision weapons, threats to secure second strikes, the ability to conduct ballistic missile defense missions, a whole host of things. So it's pretty fundamental, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I mean, you've alluded to what I think is probably some, I don't know what they call it, a psychodynamic or what it is, but it's like whenever there's a new technology, a new breakthrough, a new type of thing that could be developed, there's always somebody who wants to do it, even if it's a terrible idea. And it seems to me that putting the brakes on and saying, here's a line, you cannot produce this new system, this is forbidden, that is often extremely difficult. I mean, I'm thinking back to even the first nuclear test. This maybe is apocryphal, but my recollection was that some scientists at that time believed that if you ignited a nuclear explosion, as it was going to happen in Alamogordo, that you would maybe ignite the nitrogen in the atmosphere, and that would be the end of the planet. And yet they went ahead and did it. That is, that's a kind of example, if that really happened that way, that makes you think, how can we don't have control over the forward thrust of technology. It has its own momentum, and people just can't bring themselves to say no. Am I worrying about something unreasonable?
Unfortunately, I think there is something to that, sort of an infatuation with technology and technological determinism and all of that. I think you're completely right. Although the first test of nuclear weapons, ultimately that is a political decision that somebody takes with the information that, as you said, about what could have happened. I think you're right. I mean, it's why it's so important that the understanding at all levels, including the public, of these types of risks is high, because it's from the public, it's from others, that you can put pressure on this up. Agreed, some of it is secretive, and that's difficult, but that's where it has to come from. I think if the lessons of particularly the nuclear age are anything to go by, then it's about finding arms control, and arms control in these new types of technologies has to be about finding things that neither side benefits from. The reality of geopolitics is that quite often, if there is a perceived advantage from developing a particular system or an atomic bomb, then states will do it. I mean, that's just how it works. And arms control will come afterwards if any perceived advantage is gone. The key, I think, is in trying to say to people, or trying to say to policymakers, designers, or whoever else, that there are some things that none of us benefit from. Now, you could argue that was the case with nuclear weapons, but there was a debate around it that there could be a military utility, etc. But something like an autonomous nuclear delivery system, I can't really understand that many states would think that was a real advantage in both sides having that, for example, or in one side getting it. And there, I think you can begin to construct norms or ways of arms control if it's things people will want to give up. I think some of the other technology we're talking about will be very difficult to control, purely because the states building them believe they have military utility, and until that goes, it'll be very hard to get around it. But all of it, I think, comes back to this building a picture of understanding risks and understanding that, yes, you might be able to do this, you may be able to create a new type of system, but here's all the massive problems, or here's all the risks that you take by doing it. And I think it's having that debate. It may not change the views of some policymakers, but it is making sure that those decisions are made in the right climate of ideas. And I think sometimes, well, one of the things I think has been quite good recently, and I can't speak for the past, but I don't know if it was always the case, is making sure you get political scientists or social scientists like me, policymakers, in the same room as technologists, scientists, engineers, to try and understand how each of those parties view, a particular development, and why they might think it's a good or bad idea, to try and make sure the conversation has both social, political, ethical aspects, as well as those technological, scientific ones as well, and trying to make sure both parties understand.
Okay, now this is not about nuclear weapons, but these new nuclear powered submarines that the UK, Australia, and the US have decided that they're going to develop for patrolling, I guess, mostly the South China Sea, because they're obviously looking to constrain the Chinese aspirations. And the interesting thing is, I hear, just this weekend, for example, there's been a big flap because France is mad at the US for having taken a contract away from them. Okay, there's no conversation whatever about whether or not this is really a good way to spend money, period. There's, I think Biden may have even somewhat apologized for not having consulted or informed the French before making this decision. So if he's apologetic about anything, it's for having taken a lucrative contract away from French manufacturers, and not for having spent money that should have been spent on God knows what, vaccines or new methods of research on the Arctic ice, for example, which is a far greater risk to us than some of the other than what's going on in the South China Sea. Now, I just this morning was reading something by a colleague of mine who was saying, we've been talking about needing Canada needs submarines to patrol the Arctic Ocean and maintain our sovereignty in the Arctic and so on. But, really, you could put in sensors, and that would tell you exactly everything that you really need to know, high level, good quality sensors in the Arctic, and they will tell you where other folks are going. So it sounds to me like that's a far cheaper, and maybe not even, maybe we don't even need that. But the whole point is, why are we spending this money at all on developing things that are simply can never be used for anything constructive whatsoever? There's no beneficial use for a nuclear powered submarine.
So, I mean, there are many, many others that are better placed to speak on this than me. I've just been following it in the news, but I guess the thing to be very clear about is these are nuclear powered, and as far as we know, won't be nuclear armed. Australia doesn't have nuclear weapons. As far as we know, doesn't have any interest in developing them. They will purely be nuclear powered. The fuel presumably will come from the UK, US. They may well already have the fuel on board when they're delivered, so it can't be tampered with. It will, my understanding is it does mean it'll be outside of IAEA control because it's on submarines. The big, well, I mean, there's again, there'll be others better placed than I to give you the benefits of having a nuclear submarine over a diesel powered one. I guess it's quieter, endurance, and whatever else. But I think a couple of reasons for it is this is symbolic. This is the Biden administration saying we are serious about Asia Pacific security. We are serious about Australia as an ally. We see this as an important place where we need to reaffirm our commitments to allies in the region as well. But the flip side of it, of course, is that this sets a precedent. And in much as the US civilian energy deal, the so-called 123 agreement with India set a precedent or kind of went against the grain in terms of how nuclear order was managed, this risks setting a precedent that other countries can divert nuclear fuel to submarines. There's a possibility that you can use, or the UK and US submarines use very highly enriched uranium in their reactors. That, of course, is technically weapons grade. Other countries don't. They use lower. So it just creates a number of complications and problems. But it's something that, as you said, the only apology was perhaps to France for gazumping a very, very large contract. But this is all about geopolitics, I think.
Yeah. Okay, now a few months ago, I did a talk show in which we were discussing the new British policy about setting changing the limits on the number of nuclear weapons that they would maintain. And I wonder if there's been any further development on that that I'm not aware of. Are you any more informed now than you were a few months ago about what this means? Does it mean they're actually going to increase the number of nuclear weapons on the Trident, or the number of Trident? They're not going to build more subs, I guess, but more weapons on the Trident, or does it mean that that they're just acknowledging that they already had more than they claimed, or what do you think that means? And is there any political pushback against that now, or has that just died away as an issue in Britain?
It's died away as an issue. It's died away as an issue. There was never really any proper explanation of what it was about. It was, of course, it was linked to the integrated review of defense and security policy and an MOD paper that came out at the same time, which was about linked with this global Britain brand and a whole host of other things. I suppose to sort of put it in perspective, there won't be any more submarines. The new submarines which are being built to replace the current Vanguard class will have less missile tubes, so they won't be able to carry, in theory, as many missiles and therefore warheads as the current ones. I don't think this is coming clean about having more warheads than we've admitted. I just don't see any real advantage in that. My guess is it could be one of a number of things that this has happened for, and probably got nothing to do with deterrence, threat perceptions, or anything else. It could be to do with facilitating the new warhead, which the UK with the US will have to build. And that might mean at certain points, the UK stockpile will rise slightly as warheads are being replaced and some are coming on board. It could be something to do with that. It could be part of this broader policy of being less transparent about what the UK deploys. So its enemies are less sure of what is on each one of those submarines. But realistically, I can't see how it would change massively what it's done for best part of a decade, which is say that it would deploy no more than 40 warheads on each submarine. There's no real advantage. There's no real obvious link between what the UK has said and, for example, putting 60 warheads on a submarine. I don't see how that changed anybody else's response. So I don't know. The really interesting thing is it seems a strange decision. It seems one that will, while it's been forgotten in the UK, it certainly won't be forgotten in the NPT review conference. It certainly won't be forgotten by other states that are also maybe incrementally increasing their nuclear arsenals. And it doesn't seem to really make any difference to UK capability as far as I can see. Mm-hmm. If the UK was really worried about, as I think it says in the integrated review, new types of challenges, threats to deterrence and other stuff, then you'd build more submarines, you'd have more missiles, you'd think about a different delivery system. You wouldn't necessarily increase the cap on the number of stockpile warheads. So they haven't actually said they'll increase the number of operational warheads, which is a slightly different number than the total stockpile. So it leads me to suspect this is as much about either facilitating the transition between warheads, or possibly two, about buying enough or being involved in enough of the warheads to make the deal palatable to the US Congress, to make sure it funds the new, and forgive me, the might be the new W90, I can't remember which one it is, but a new warhead for the US Navy, which it doesn't really need, but which the UK needs to build its own ones. Mm-hmm. If you can follow that.
Well, it is sort of a Byzantine, it's a set of calculations, but I think I can trace through it if I have the motivation. This has been fascinating, and I'm really glad to have a chance to get back in touch with you. And I want to praise you for continuing this kind of research, because it's so important. So good wishes for it. Thank you so much.
Well,
thank you.